too addicted to watches. Today, we're looking at a watch that comes from a brand that for some is a bit controversial. That brand is Glycine, and this watch in particular comes from the period of time for the brand when the events that resulted in this occurred. The watch itself is not controversial, however, and is more or less unanimously liked. This is the Glycine Combat Sub GL0093, also known as the Goldeneye. It's fairly obvious where the watch gets its name from, that beautiful bronze-coloured bezel insert. But before we look at it properly, let's talk about the Glycine brand a little bit. The Glycine brand came to life in 1914, founded by Eugene Malin, making it over 100 years old. One of the watches that put the brand on the map is the Airman, a pilot's watch, which is a 24-hour watch and popular even today with collectors. While first made in the 50s, its popularity grew during the Vietnam War. The brand has a rich history and is well regarded for its contribution to aviation watchmaking. Fast forward to 2016, and a majority stake of the company is purchased by the Invicta Group. If you're not familiar with Invicta, which you probably are if you're watching the channel, they are the poster child for insane RRPs that are perpetually discounted and reduced. There was even a promotion they ran: buy 2, get 4 more free. That should tell you just about all you need to know about the brand. After the acquisition, many feared that Glycine would go in a similar direction, or at the very least the quality would suffer. There were some reports of early batches of watches having issues, but as far as I can tell, that has long since disappeared and was likely a one-off mistake. This particular watch was produced during that time of the changeover, but I can't fault the quality, so take that how you will. The Combat Sub line from Glycine is quite prolific, with an extensive range of colour, size and dial options. The size options available are probably where we can see an influence from Invicta. While the smallest is 39mm, the largest goes all the way up to 48mm. The one I have comes from the 42mm range, and there are also 44 and 46 options too. Dials and colours vary greatly, with some using round markers and others numbers. Glycine even collaborated with the sales website Massdrop, now Drop, to create a GMT that looks suspiciously similar in design to some other famous red and blue GMT watches. Not that I have anything against homages. If you like it, buy it. No matter your taste, there is probably a variant of the Combat Sub to suit. Now, let's have a look at the watch itself. Aside from the looks, I'd say the standout feature of this watch is just how thin it is while still retaining 200 meters of water resistance. I've currently got the watch on this black NATO strap with matching PVD hardware, but even with it, the watch is incredibly thin. Moving the strap out of the way a little, you can really see how thin it is. This watch has a thickness of just 10.6mm, something that most other dive watches struggle with. This results in the watch being incredibly comfortable to wear. We'll come back around to the case, but for now, let's move closer in and check out the dial. While there is nothing crazy going on here, it doesn't really need to be with that bezel. That said, it is still very tastefully done, with small lume dots and rectangles on the hours, as well as 13 to 24 markings inside of those. The inclusion of this on the dial, which is something normally on field watches, really emphasizes the intentions of Glycine that this watch was made to be practically used. Outside of those markers is a minute track that frames the dial nicely. Moving back to the 3 o'clock, we have a date complication that is framed with just a printed square. This is fine with me, as the lume is not applied, so if this was, it would stand out a bit. While I don't think that date wheels always need to be color matched, I'm glad this one is, because a white one would overpower the balance of the dial, since the marker at 9 is quite thin. Above the pinion, we have the only piece of applied material on the dial, in the form of the brand logo, with the brand name printed underneath. It's a nice little touch that catches the light along with the hands. Below the pinion, we have arguably a bit too much text. The designers at Glycine might have been taking inspiration from the Tudor Pelagos with all of this text, but the graphic designer in me at least appreciates the fact that they chose to justify the text so that it at least makes a nice rectangle of text down there. Finally, at the bottom of the dial there is, for some, those all-important words, Swiss made. This is all covered by a flat sapphire crystal that, although has a claimed 3 layers of anti-reflective coating, could have used a few more, as it catches fingerprints and reflections much too easily. It can say Swiss made on the dial because of the movement ticking away inside of the watch. Glycine call this movement the caliber GL224 to give the impression of in-houseness, but in reality it's either an ETA or a Solita. I say either because both were used in the backs of combat subs depending on the particular batch that was made, and I haven't been curious enough to open the back of mine to find out which I have. Either way, you can rest assured that you have a reliable Swiss-made movement with a higher than most Seiko's beat rate of 28,800 beats per hour, or 8 Hz. Being driven by the movement, the hands on this watch are quite simple fence post hands. The hour hand is wider than the minute hand and reaches just to the edge of those 13 to 24 numbers printed around the dial. The minute hand is much longer and narrower by comparison, and reaches to just inside the printed minute track, outside of those hour markers. The second hand is also fairly simple, with a paddle-style loomed tip, and it extends just a touch further than the minute hand. The hands are actually a rose gold colour rather than gold to match the bezel and crown. On paper, this doesn't make much sense, but in reality, this makes the hands match more closely with the bezel insert and look much more appropriate. We finally arrive at the likely reason that most of you are watching this video, that fantastic bezel surrounding the dial. The bezel itself is gold in colour, with a coin edge and a slight raised lip around the loom pip at 12 o'clock. Probably surprising and maybe disappointing is the fact that it's only a 60 click bezel rather than 120. This means that as you turn it, it turns 1 second's worth around the dial, hence 60, whereas 120 click turns in half-second increments. In theory, this allows you to more accurately set the time on the bezel for a dive or any other purpose, but honestly, I don't imagine very many people actually using this as a diver and really needing that extra bit of accuracy. I think in reality, it's just a fancy fidget spinner for anyone that uses it. The insert though, that's a different story. It was the reason I and most others bought this watch. The combination of black and gold is used universally and for good reason. It looks awesome, and this slightly darker bronze looks equally good. It's not a colour you see commonly on bezels either. If a watch does have a metallic insert, 99% of the time it will be a silver one. The uniqueness of this watch is a big draw for many, I feel. It really speaks for itself. Now onto that case. We know it's thin and comfortable. As I mentioned, I have the model with the case size of 42mm, and that height comes in at just 10.6mm. Lug to lug is also kept relatively compact by short stubby lugs at 49.5mm. Anytime a watch comes in under 50mm on the lug to lug, it usually means it's going to wear pretty well on most wrists. Finally, in proportion with that 42mm case diameter, the lug width of the GL0093 is 22mm. It came on a regular strap of leather-backed fabric, but this NATO strap, which is quite thin, is more comfortable for me. The case itself is PVD black-coated stainless steel, while the bezel and crown are gold. Finishing on the case is simple but well executed, with satin brushing on the top of the lugs and polishing on the sides of the case. However, due to the PVD coating, that polishing is not so obvious. That gold crown is quite large and grippy, which is a good thing because it screws down. It also features the brand logo embossed rather than engraved, a nice touch. Operating the crown on this watch is an interesting experience. Before I bought the watch, I had heard that winding the movement was much smoother than others, but until I got my own, I didn't really understand what they meant. However, as you can hopefully hear, the individual ticks of the click spring are not very distinct, and instead, a more smooth blended sound is made. The feeling while turning is similar. It's not bad at all, and just feels very smooth to turn. It feels like a strange thing to comment on, but the weight of resistance to turn the crown is very nice. More than usual on watches, but not too much to make it difficult. Something else on the watch I don't always talk about is the case back. On this watch, it's a closed case back, so you can't see the movement, but instead, Glycine have lightly engraved this image, which is a bit like a coat of arms featuring 2 seals and a trident, alluding to the fact that this is indeed a dive watch. Around the outside of this is the usual spec list, but a nice little detail is that the model name has been filled in with white to make it stand out from all the other text. So, I've got this on a NATO strap, but the one it originally came on is still a perfectly good strap. I actually really like the texture of it, but personally, unless a leather strap is already soft when I get it, I don't usually bother to break it in and just swap it out. I can't tell you why, but I have a tendency to keep the original leather straps that come with watches unworn and replace them, even if they are high quality straps. Now, this is a dive watch, even if most of these watches won't go anywhere near water, but there are 2 elements it needs. One is that rotating bezel to keep track of your time underwater, and the other is lume on the hands, indices and bezel insert. In terms of lume, this watch is fighting an uphill battle. Indices are printed rather than applied, which generally results in weaker performance, and they are also fairly small in size. Even with that in mind, they barely live up to expectations. I have seen better lume on AliExpress watches costing $100 or less. Thankfully, the bezel action on the other hand makes an attempt to make up for that lume. Firstly, the insert lines up perfectly with the dial, something Seiko watches struggle with at all price points. And the action, though 60 click as mentioned, is very tactile with no backplay at all. Take a listen. The coin edge texture on the bezel also makes it quite easy to grip and turn. The only complaint I have about the bezel is that there is a bit of lateral movement, so the bezel itself wiggles a bit on the case if you push it. Now with all that out of the way, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. We can finally see that flat profile of the case in action as I turn my wrist. Even though it has a slightly large case at 42mm, the fact that it sits so close to my wrist makes it very comfortable and easy to wear. Of course, the short lug-to-lug also helps with the wearing experience. You can see the way that the bezel plays with the light because of the almost sunburst finish it has. It was meant to draw attention to itself, and it sure does a good job of that. Changing out the NATO for the original strap, we can see it the way Glycine intended it. By no means is this a bad look for the watch at all, and really emphasizes the thinness of the case with no pass-through strap behind it. A rubber strap that I use for my Samurai also has a similar effect, while also being very soft, light and comfortable too. So how do I feel about this watch? Well, I love the way it looks with the contrasting black and gold color tones, but I just wish they hadn't cut corners with the lume. It is a big, glaring weakness on an otherwise solid watch. The later designs in the Combat Sub line seem to have tried to address this, as they feature bigger indices and hands, but since I haven't handled one of those, I can't really comment on their performance. Besides that though, I really do like the watch, and whenever I am wearing it, I thoroughly enjoy it. If you've seen my videos about other watches in my collection, you will generally see that I prefer watches that don't immediately draw attention to themselves, but rather instead show their true colors in the finer details. This particular watch goes against all that, but I think most collections need something like this to break up the monotony. What do you think about this watch? Have you got one of the newer versions? Is the Invicta ownership too much for you and stops you from getting one? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.